Chapter 5: Social Revolutions and Civil Rebellion. My mother is standing in the center of the living room, happy as always, but also almost crying. I'm 8 and my cute brother Uri is 5, running around among the planks, tools, and sawdust scattered everywhere. My dad decided to dismantle the closet he put together third time because it came out a bit lopsided. I'm looking as hard as I can and still think it's straight, as does my mother. David, I love it like that. Daddy, it's straight. I'm also putting in my 2 cents worth, but there's no point in arguing. My dependable dad wants the perfect closet, and the miserable thing was dismantled and reassembled repeatedly until it was straight as a builder's level because wonky things need to be fixed by taking them apart and reassembling them. Civil rebellion isn't revolution. Both occur because the public has a burning need for change. But while civil rebellion is the hot-headed little bro of revolutions, the latter is an outcome of new concepts for an alternative reality. Many revolutions have aspired to economic equality at any price, an ambition that has repeatedly been problematic across human history, simply because, as we've noted, talent isn't divided up fairly among people. The inevitable result is that an economic struggle won't end with a statistically uniform distribution. A relatively small number of people will rake in the majority of the kitty. In other words, and this is the important bit, any economic goal, even if it doesn't take the form of ownership of capital, for example, a desired employment position, but is viewed as valuable by a large number of people, will create an unavoidable hierarchy. If we err in favor of illusion by trying to artificially eradicate the annoying asymmetry, the outcome will be either economic degeneration, as occurred in the total collapse of the USSR in the 1990s, or the implementation of a highly centralized government, such as in China. Both are countries where the individual does the absolute maximum in order to do the minimum required of her or him. None of this teaches us, of course, that the socioeconomic structure we're living in now is ideal. On the contrary, capitalism has led to an array of crazy actions that we continue to live with to date, such as linking the dollar to itself, or the accepted business mechanism where decision makers, company leaders, and directors do not feel any responsibility towards the company. And this means that there's no point in siding categorically with a particular concept. Each method has its advantages and disadvantages. Social revolutions don't occur only because of economic discrimination or idealistic dreams about fixing up society. They occur because the existing social reality is insufferable for a certain sector of society, for any number of reasons. The term equality used to be affiliated exclusively with the economic aspect of our existence, but in the past half-century or so, it has donned a new cloak: gender equality. The feminist struggle began with the suffragettes in the 1920s. Women were seeking equal rights to vote, but that success only drove the demand for equality in other areas. By the way, the feminist movement is typically viewed as having 4 waves. The first, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, dealt with the most basic rights denied women, such as voting and choice of employment. The second, 1960-1990, dealt with broader areas of equality, including the protest against the expectation that women should dress in feminine clothing and present an appearance that reflects men's wishes. The third wave, 1990s and early 2000s, sought to dismantle the concept of man and woman and instituted talk about gender, as well as feminist voices of Black women and women in minorities. And the fourth wave, since about 2012, has to a great degree continued the third, seeking to unify the struggle of various minorities and make broader use of media and social networks. A short story from the 1980s is important here. My family sat down to dinner, everyone waiting for our mother's daily snippets about her work. Her life story, like that of so many women, reflects the status of women in that period. Having completed grade 11 at high school, she needed to ask her father's permission to continue on to grade 12 and earn her matriculation. He said no, it was time for her to go out and work. No matter how she begged and cried, and to this day she recalls the pillow that was wet with tears for several months, no meant no. Despite the obstacles, my mother found herself integrating into very challenging work and being viewed as diligent and highly intelligent. Her dominant trait was insisting on truth and daring to speak it to her superiors. And that's how I learned about women's rights and standing steadfast against forces greater than yourself. I can't recall a week going by without my mother describing some demeaning or belittling episode towards her. Some women, though, couldn't withstand the pressures, not wanting to rock the boat. Or as my mother would say at our family dinners, they were even forced to give themselves. Yes. When my mother once tried to dissuade one of them, she was given the shocking response, "Sometimes you need to know when not to see." That was the atmosphere leading to the women's liberation movement, whose stated objective was to battle a social climate pervaded by patriarchism and sexism. #MeToo marked the start of the fourth feminist wave, which naturally leveraged the internet as a tool of female empowerment, protesting harassment, sexual violence, and rape culture. Fourth wave feminism advanced on the waves of the absolutely justified previous waves, but its goals are important to discuss. The book viewed as the Bible of feminist thought, Manifesta, Young Women, Feminism, and the Future, declared its purpose as searing into the public's awareness the fact that male domination does affect the women of our generation. The statement, considered by many as fundamental, was adopted by fiercely driven contemporary feminists. To them, the Western world currently suffers from patriarchal despotism. The starting point is that the Western world is founded on male domination infused with violent characteristics. This idea is identical to that of Marxist class war, except that in fourth wave feminism, socioeconomic status is swapped for gender. The claim of male domination is admittedly based facts that clearly point to inequality. It's true that men hold the bulk of world capital, that men hold the majority of governing positions, and that men display violence towards women rather than vice versa. As we've already noted, men at the far ends of the bell curve tend to extremism, which can be expressed in excessive competitiveness and even violence. But men are not despots, and women aren't subject to them anymore. Women and men cope together alongside each other with life's difficulties and are forced to divvy the tasks out based on their skills. It's enough to mention that most homeless, war dead, and prisoners are also men in order to understand that the system of Western values is neither clear nor simple. And all in all, it's not entirely certain that men really do have the upper hand. When I started writing this chapter, I interviewed 10 women, 7 CEOs and senior managers, and 3 feminist activists. The women in top-level positions were unanimous in their views on today's feminism, claiming that it presents an excessively superficial world which contains only goodies and baddies. The concept is easy to buy, and many are happy to buy it. Social conventions are created only as a result of thousands of years of social changes and environmental criteria. So we shouldn't make light of attempts at re-engineering human behavior because even if society knows where it's directing its steps, it certainly can't forecast all outcomes of its actions. Blatant sexual harassment and other negative experiences suffered by women during their careers are lessening by virtue of this fourth wave. But simultaneously, there's also a counter effect of increasing hostility, suspicion, and alienation towards women in the workplace. When female students come to consult with me in my office at the university, I find myself in a highly vulnerable position. Fear of false accusations forces me to leave the door open, and I'm always careful that additional people are in the room with me. I'm not being paranoid. My personal feelings are backed up by interesting recent research that examined how men and women feel about these social changes. Men and women have been robbed of the opportunity to develop connections in a free and natural manner, which has robbed all of us of the spontaneity around developing romantic relations. And that, in my view, was one of the nicest bits of life. For years, feminism worked against the insufferable disparity between women's rights compared to men's. But in its current form, it far exceeds this sphere, because feminism, like so many other isms, has now become controlled by its extreme militant wing. A claim made by radical feminists is that the two genders should exist identically. Israeli Knesset member Merav Mikhaeli, the woman most identified with Israeli feminism, is extremely careful about always speaking in the feminine form, since Hebrew is a grammatically two-gendered language. She tends to dress in black, and always presents herself in public with her hair gathered. She has claimed that these are manifestations of freedom and equality by virtue of being the opposite of the feminine stereotype. Her severe approach doesn't seem to be viewed by too many women as an invitation to take part in the feminist struggle. During my interviews with the 3 radical feminist activists, they vehemently demanded absolute and full identicality between the genders. I'm certainly not claiming that there are 2 completely different beings. After all, men's and women's capabilities are fairly equal, but they most certainly aren't identical, and as we've seen, there are statistical differences in a range of spheres. There's no use denying that. Attributing every difference in the outcomes to educational biases reminds me of Albert Einstein's warning on scientific method. Everything must be made as simple as possible, but not one bit simpler. During the interview conversations, I found that any attempt on my part to question some of those beliefs was met by fury, and often enough with the addition of shouts along the lines of, "You're claiming that the world is flat." Those are exactly the kinds of voices being heard loud and clear in the public space, whereas more moderate voices are either drowned out or not heard at all. This reality makes it harder for young women in general to identify with the feminist movement. Surveys conducted worldwide between 2017 to 2019 indeed found that only a small number of women now identify as active feminists, women who feel that the term feminist describes them very well, with 30% in the UK, 8% in Germany, and about 20% in the USA, although the majority of women do state that they are definitely in favor of equal opportunity for women and men. If that's the case, it beggars the question, how is it that a minority can affect such a major social change? We'll talk about that in more detail later. But for now, there's another, no less burning issue we need to look at, the conceptual background leading to America's street riots. The left and the politicization of identities. In 1927, a young American woman named Carrie Buck appealed to the Supreme Court after she was marked as a candidate for coerced sterilization in accordance with Indiana's law, allowing sterilization of the incapable. The law was based on a pseudo-scientific theory known as eugenics. Her appeal was overturned by 8 judges to 1. In his verdict, the lead judge wrote, "It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices, often not felt to be such by those concerned, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Oliver Wendell Jones, Buck versus Bell. The verdict, which promoted eugenics to a raison d'etre, turned sterilization and castration into a norm in the USA even before the rise of Nazism. The theory of eugenics claimed to map the formative factors in the human race and sought to bring about its improvement. It used pseudo-scientific methods to address issues such as the link between facial features and the social position of any person. An outcome of this corrupt theory developed into the operative arm of race improvement, which was never legally proven and was always cruel. Its influence also spread into Britain, Canada, and other Western countries. With this as a background, postmodernism's central concept sounds logical. If the great horrors of the 20th century grew from seemingly rational ideas, then there's a good reason to re-examine the concept of rationality. In addition to the dreadful outcomes of eugenics and fascist regimes, seemingly enlightened communism can also claim the dubious honor of some 30 million victims in the USSR, 36 million in China, who died of starvation under Mao Zedong's cruelty, some 1,700,000 murdered by communist Cambodia's Khmer Rouge, and more. We can perhaps claim that some of these regimes started off with good intentions, but Bertrand Russell describes his face-to-face conversation with a grinning Lenin, who said that there are poor farmers and rich farmers. We drove the poor ones to rebel against the wealthy and murder them. Look for the video on YouTube. And so, because the only historical rational ideas which connected humans as a society turned out to be dreadful, the individual was left with only one choice: reject every ideology. There's no absolute truth. Every point of view is thus legitimate, and it's impossible to impose one individual's moralities on another. The outcome is that any attempt to find a unifying common denominator is inapplicable, and anyhow, the very idea of nationalism is foolish. In fact, postmodernism views all social conduct as a violent, ongoing power struggle between groups that are unable to hold productive discourse. Even the individual within the group has her or his own truth, which is why this approach only encourages fragmentation, each to her or himself. Postmodernist philosophy, then, paints a picture for society that is bleak and absent of hope. Black Lives Matter. The struggle by America's Black Lives Matter movement, BLM, is also a representation of postmodernist discourse. BLM's main claim is that over the years, there's been institutional discrimination against dark-skinned people. Remember Chapter 1 and the redlining by the American establishment? Indeed, discrimination exists. The problem is that this perception automatically leads to an understanding that if blacks are discriminated against, it must be whites enacting the discrimination, all whites. This was the outlook driving the riots across America in reaction to the documented murder of George Floyd, an African-American citizen living in North Carolina. 4 Minneapolis police force officers were charged with his murder, and the act aroused broad protests against police cruelty and racism, against institutional discrimination of all kinds, and later on against the white population in totality, labeled privileged. I'm not saying that whites don't hold some degree of preferential status, but to clarify this issue better, I'd suggest putting this book aside for a few minutes to watch an amazing and eye-opening film that portrays the black side in this issue incredibly well. Look for the full film version of Jane Elliott, A Class Divided. The philosophical concepts behind this civil rebellion are understood better if we look at Project 1619, instigated by the New York Times. In 1619, a year before the arrival of modern America's founders on the Mayflower, a different boat arrived on the country's shores. It contained the first shipment of slaves destined for what would be the USA. Project 1619 began activities in 2019 and seeks to describe enslavement and racial discrimination as the primary force behind the current situation experienced by people of color. The project raised great interest. Its organizers received extensive media coverage, but a glance at its list of published articles raises concerns. America wasn't a democracy until Black Americans made it. Myths about physical racial differences were used to justify slavery and are still believed by doctors today. Why is everyone always stealing Black music? According to leading historians, Project 1619 goes one step too far and describes the American Revolution in a very one-sided light, which is racist at core, when the historical truth is very different. Supporting BLM requires turning our backs on and scorning Central Western ethoses. Statues and monuments in the USA and Europe that acknowledge people and events perceived by BLM as linked to slavery or racism were vandalized, removed, or demolished. Among the dozens treated this way in the USA alone are some 40 statues of Christopher Columbus, Thomas Jefferson, and Winston Churchill. Thomas Jefferson, among America's founding fathers, actually worked hard at freeing slaves via laws and actions, but he himself didn't let his own slaves go free and was silent on the issue during his presidency. About a year after the riots, his statue was also removed from New York City Hall, as was that of Theodore Roosevelt. BLM protesters set up CHAZ, an autonomous zone in Capitol Hill, Seattle, and prevented police forces from entering. They also demanded that police forces be defunded by providing them with only half the budget, the other half to be redirected to programs and services in the Black community. Here's where a new player entered the arena, Twitter's CEO Jack Dorsey, who recommended that the protesters use an encoded app to pass messages among themselves, which would bypass police access. CHAZ quickly became a center of national attention, drawing demonstrators from across the USA. Estimates indicate that the great majority of demonstrations were peaceful, but 7% were extremely violent. This all took place close to election time. The media that identified with the opposition in the USA assisted in fanning the flames by emphasizing the violent demonstrations where protesters clashed with the police. The media primarily took the protesters' side and harshly condemned anyone criticizing them. This is how sports broadcaster Grant Napier found himself fired from radio and TV stations after he tweeted that all lives matter every single one of them. A New York Times opinion column editor was also forced to resign after publishing a column by Senator Cotton which called for intervention by the American military to cope with the riots. By contrast, when the editor of the 1619 Project explained that destroying property is not violence, her statements were praised. The utterly absurd outcome of the identities politicization discourse was that hundreds of businesses owned by African Americans were burned to the ground because they were adjacent to those of whites. But the right also takes part in this fest by offering a mirror image of identity politicization. Nationalism, which in its populist form is similar to identity politics. It's a perception where the people are at the center of a moral dispute against the others. And these others could be the social elite, local minorities, immigrants, or foreigners. Unlike identity politics, populism tries to differentiate only one subgroup and define it as the real people, who of course are moral, whereas everyone else isn't. This discourse directs itself at the public while making use of simplistic and easily assimilated messages that rely on denial of the problem's complexities, anti-elitism, and distrust. We're the people, not you, a populist nationalist. In recent years, counter-populist movements have begun popping up, opposing the postmodern idea that promotes values such as feminism, LGBTQ+ rights, secularism, and concern for minorities, not thereby abandoning nationalism. As far as the populist political right is concerned, these values endanger basic local values and traditions in favor of concern for all humanity. The problem with a counter-movement peaking too quickly is that it can easily end in anarchism by undermining the authority of state institutions and even the most basic societal values. The practical outcome of populist leadership is that it nurtures a sense of constant crisis, which enables taking radical steps even when there's no need for them. Although it's a great setting for establishing governance, it simultaneously differentiates sectors within the society. Responsible leadership, on the other hand, understands that responsibility means also being able to lose occasionally in the constant tug-of-war between the political sides in favor of the public. The instability model. In previous chapters, we looked more closely at processes that are at the very root of social instability in the non-virtual world. Illustration 18 provides a graphic organization of the principles we've learned so far. To those who are listening to the audiobook, I suggest you pick up a hard copy or a digital version and take a look at it. Illustration 18 depicts the connections between differences among groups, inequality of opportunity, inequality of expenditure, social polarization, and instability. These are mitigated by processes we already discussed, like governmental policy, the Pareto principle, the Schelling model, and rapid population changes. Additionally, the illustration includes processes that we haven't talked about yet, such as media bias, the naming game, and social network interests. Society very naturally splits into groups of countless kinds: conservatives and liberals, immigrants and locals, legal and illegal immigrants, religiously devout and atheists, etc. The differences between groups create tensions that can be lived with peacefully, as long as the size of any group is small. But as soon as we relate to a country's population or that of a large metropolis, Schelling's model begins to appear. The model teaches us that very quickly and naturally, almost independent of racism or any wish to differentiate among the groups, separation does occur and becomes easily identified visually, and that harnesses the differences among the groups. The separation may be geographic, such as Black neighborhoods or Jewish ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in the USA. It may be employment-based, such as salary differentials by gender. It may be cultural, and so on. Differences among groups can deepen when changes occur too quickly, making it impossible for society in general to cope with them in its slow and sluggish way. These changes can be driven by epidemics, natural catastrophes, mass immigration, or economic crises. Disparities and differences among groups together with unequal opportunities are causes for social instability, whether by design due to government policies or by coincidence. But inequality is an inevitable outcome of society's complexity, and the Pareto model shows that it becomes naturally empowered and can be expected to exist, even in the absence of differences between groups and in a state of totally equal opportunity. It's hard to estimate what kind of force majeure would accelerate processes and bring on the outbreak of significant rebellion. The ecological crisis we're dealing with can of course lead to social uncertainty worldwide, but less dramatic events such as the end of Pax Americana or the resurfacing of a Cold War vis-a-vis China or Russia, which, as it seems, initiated again with the invasion of Russia to Ukraine in 2022, could also cause similar results. The 2018 Yellow Vests protest in France in response to fuel tax hikes came to the fore via social networks. 2 years later, the tax was lowered, but the protest didn't dissipate since its roots are well entrenched in the unequal division of resources between city residents and those of the peripheries in France. A pandemic can also stir up rebellion, although as for now it seems that as of 2022, the Western world survived the coronavirus outbreak. Historic research reviewed 57 plagues from 1347, when the Black Plague broke out in Asia and Europe, killing 25% to 60% of the European population and some 35 million people in China, and up to 1920 when the Spanish influenza broke out. The study concluded that other than 4 of the 57, all plagues resulted in civil rebellion directly linked to the plague. In each instance of plague, the general population placed the blame on minorities, an aspect worth thinking about in contemporary Israeli, Brazilian, American, and European societies. Researchers concluded that this surprisingly consistent outcome was embedded in the fact that the problems already present in those societies prior to the plague's outbreak were significantly magnified from the citizens' perspective during the outbreaks. Social tensions and inequality of outcomes lead politicians and social activists to use the most effective electoral tools available to them in a democracy: the politicization of identities and populism, which arouse and embody social polarization. The arena where all these movements and trends manifest is social networks, and everyone knows how that works. 1. Someone writes an opinion that is intellectually reasoned and balanced and sits well with the opinions of a broad group. 2. Remember the distribution of intelligence curve? The more the writer's views represent increasingly complex considerations, the smaller the population that will be impressed by them. Few people will respond, and there may even be responders who haven't read the material and will freely admit it with TLDR, internet slang for too long, didn't read. 3. Our writer gets upset. If it's really important to express her or his views, next time our writer will hone the language, keep the arguments short, or may even stop bothering. 4. Our writer's friend, on the other hand, starts out by appealing to a broad audience. Said friend starts each post with a simple statement such as, elitist leftists, or the president's supporters are idiots, and so on. The friend's arguments are shallow, one-sided, and meant to flame emotions, especially hatred. 5. It's hard to remain apathetic towards what's been written. Many will agree with the posted views and easily get the arguments and therefore share the post. Facebook knows this, and as a profit-making business also promotes this attitude. 6. Anyone not agreeing with said friend feels offended and has trouble not responding and answering. But then comes the pelting of disagreement from the friend's loyal followers. In many cases, the attacked responder will simply unfollow or unfriend the post's originator, but will continue receiving messages from the social networks of similar posts. This dynamic, together with the network strategies, which we'll look at in the next chapter, produces 2 separate groups, each leveling harsh claims at the other. Posters will quickly find themselves surrounded by like-minded people, but with a small representation from an opposing view. If they don't pay close attention, a wonderful feeling will spread through them. Their views are acceptable to a majority of similar, normal people. And the other side, they're just crazy out of their minds. Why has this polarization spiraled out of control over the past few years? The answer opens a window onto a completely different world.